Good day, Billy. First of all, let me thank you for agreeing to do this video interview with me today. For our audience, could you please give us a little bit of background about your role and experiences in learning and development?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Guy, and good morning. Thanks for asking me to do this interview. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. So, I am currently, I guess my job title is Senior Engineer in the Nuclear Training Group at Ontario Power Generation. Effectively, what I am is an e-learning instructional designer and analyst, and I do a little bit of e-learning strategy and just learning and development type stuff. But I've only been doing learning and development stuff for about 6 years. Before that, I had a number of roles. My original, I started in the nuclear power industry back in the last century, last millennium, as a nuclear engineer, doing very technical, like reactor physics and reactor engineering type stuff. And then I had to do a root cause analysis for some problem, and found that I really liked the performance improvement aspects of that, and just the idea of analyzing problems and learning how to fix things. And so that led to a bunch of different roles, and then moving from the States up here to Canada. So, but that's I think that's enough for now.
All right. Maybe we'll get into the 5 whys and why you don't like it, and then I have 4 more whys to follow it, if you will, but that's just our inside joke. Now to the main event. We're here to talk about adaptive learning. So can you share with us a little bit about your thinking about adaptive learning? So what is adaptive learning according to Billy?
Adaptive learning, well, so I primarily focus on the e-learning aspect of it, right? But adaptive learning, if you go back to any kind of live instruction you've ever had, has been somewhat adaptive, right? The teacher or the instructor, whether they start off trying to adapt or not, they will adapt their delivery based on how you or the class are doing, right? So it could be a tutor, right? It could be an one-on-one tutoring, which is kind of the epitome of fully adaptive, continuous adaptation. Basically full continuous adaptation to you, what you understand, and what, if it's a really good tutor, what they think you are ready to take in next. So instead of a cut and dried lesson plan that's and a fixed delivery that goes from one, a broadcast from me to a whole classroom, it's now become something that's a little more personalized to you, your knowledge, and what you're currently understanding, maybe not understanding. So to me, that's adaptive learning. So it can be done e-learning, or it can be done in real life. But it's not really very common in e-learning, which is unfortunate, because this is not a new idea. If you go back to the 60s, there are people talking about this with those monstrous fill up a data center single computer that can, is less powerful than what you have on your desktop. They were already talking about this stuff. And some early systems were developed. The name of one of them I can remember is Plato, as a pretty famous one. And there are lots of different ways to present information electronically, take input and feedback from the learner or the user, and provide them feedback on, maybe, oh, that's not correct. Here's what you actually meant, or no, sorry, it's not telling you what you should think, but it's this is the correct answer and why, right? And then if it's a smarter system, it will then perhaps change path, right? It's like if you've been getting a bunch of answers correct and you're getting stuff like this, it may move you onto a fast track. Or if you're not, for whatever reason, maybe you had no familiarity with this topic at all, no background, maybe you just didn't have some of the things that the information that leads up to this, it might take you on a slightly slower path or a lot slower path, depending on what you need. So to me, in a nutshell, that's adaptive learning. It's a feedback loop between the programmed part of the instruction and the process part, which is you. You are like in an industrial control system. If I want to control the level in a tank, I've got to watch the level in the tank to actually know whether to open or close the valve, right? So you're the tank.
Yes, that's so true. So from an e-learning perspective, well, this sounds like this is just involves, branching, which is what an instructor or a coach might do. They're deciding, okay, you already know this. I'll go on to the next thing. Or you don't know this. We're going to have to go a little bit deeper on all of this and catch you up to speed if it's a prerequisite knowledge or skill to wherever we're going with all of this. Is what you're talking about any different than how some people might be talking about adaptive learning?
It is. And so it's interesting that, so you brought up branching. So I think that I have read the meeting notes from the first meeting of the National Society for Programmed Instruction, which is a rather long document. Yeah, it's great. It's absolutely great. It's a gold mine of ideas, which are still so much of it is still relevant today. So there was programmed instruction kind of bad rap at some point, despite a lot of early promise, and what seems to be excellent results. It got kind of a bad rap because it's a lot of people in education thought it was too robotic or it was too limiting or for whatever reason. But that's what you might call the original, or that's one style of programmed instruction. That's what you might call the B.F. Skinner style, and that's what he promoted. It started off as kind of like it starts you up. Everybody starts at the same place, and everybody goes through the exact same path. It's very linear, and you don't get to proceed unless you can do things in this order. There was another style that was developed by, I hope I don't get his name wrong, Norman Crowder, who was working for the U.S. Air Force in the 50s, and he came up with something completely different, which is essentially branching. And a lot of people, like, my age or even younger, might know. I remember having read Choose Your Own Adventure books as a kid, where you read a passage and you get to make a choice. Do you go down the dark passageway or do you go up the stairs to the roof, right? That's where I got the idea from. And I thought, and of course, being me, I thought I'd invented something cool. Oh, I'm going to apply this to instruction, right? And then I found out, oh yeah, of course, it's a 50-year-old idea. Like every other good idea I have, somebody's already thought of it. So Norman Crowder was kind of the leading light of that in the 60s and 70s. And then I found this little book about 5 years ago by Bob Mager, because I was trying to get better at the fundamentals of instructional design. So writing instructional objectives or something like that.
Yeah,
I'm starting to read this book, right? And it's written in this style. It is the choose your own lesson book. And the questions gauge your understanding of what you've just read. And depending on how you answer, which page you flip to, it's like he either tells you, no, how could you think that, right? That's the Bob Mager sense of humor I came to learn, is that he had a sense of humor and it showed up in his learning, or the stuff he wrote. So it's like, how could you think that? That's silly, right? Or you would get it right and he would continue on. So it was almost like a programmed remediation. If you didn't get the concept he just explained, he'll explain it to you again in a slightly different way, or with more detail or a little less detail, depending on what was required for the situation. So it's not perfect, and it's not the same as being there with Bob Mager discussing stuff one-on-one, but it's potentially a lot better for a reader, because if you're getting everything really fast, you might end up only having to read half the book. And then you might go through like I did and say, well, I want to see what he said and all the other stuff. So I go through and answer every question incorrectly just to see what that path was like. So, oh my God, I totally forgot what you asked me.
No, that was about, how people, if your approach or thinking about this is very different from other people. And what you really said is that these ideas go way back, and NSPI, the National Society for Programmed Instruction, started off on this. And then, I remember the gurus from the society telling me, and I joined the organization in 1979, but they talked in the early 1980s about there were two things that kind of changed that movement. And that was that even if you provided stellar instruction, it didn't change performance a whole lot. And the thought leaders like the Gary Rumlers and the Tom Gilberts and the Bob Magers and the Joe Harlesses and really literally dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of other people began to look at what are the other variables, because our goal here is not to provide instruction, but to improve performance or to create performance capabilities or competence. And so they all started branching off and looking at different aspects of that. But then the other thing was that because of the bad rap that programmed instruction sometimes got, being too linear, and then branching came along, as you say, it was whether it was better to have short frames or long frames.
Yeah.
And then the third controversy was, is there one or two M's in programming? So
yes.
So there was a lot of different thinking about all of this, but so adaptive learning, I know that when I do curriculum architecture designs, the front end of my training and development path, later on called learning paths, or learning journeys or learning experience journeys. We've got a whole bunch of different names for these kinds of things here. But the front end usually has to accommodate, there's two major things I think it needs to accommodate, and that is people may have the same job title, but they have different job assignments. And there's some things that you might do with the same, if we share the job title, things that you do in your job that I will never, ever do. And so I don't need to be trained on that. Thank you very much. And there's other things that, you come into the job knowing certain things already, and I come in knowing a different set of things. And so one of the issues has historically been, how do we accommodate, those differences, the job assignment itself and what you really need, and what you already know, your incoming knowledge and skills, your prior knowledge, and how do we accommodate that? And when we used to do mostly group-paced classroom training, my philosophy on this was always to, if I had somebody in the room who already knew the content and there were other people in the room who didn't know the content, my design had to accommodate that adult learner and allow them to be part of the delivery of the instruction and for them to have a valid role in sharing what they already knew. So that was always a discussion with clients as I started those kinds of projects was, we're going to bring some people in here. You have a target audience. Are there people going to come in here who may know some of this already? If yes is the answer, then we needed to figure out what are some of those things and how will we keep them engaged, because they can't be a learner, an active learner. They already know this. So how can they be part of the active facilitation or instruction delivery? And, but there were, sometimes people would come in and they go, hey, I know my job. I don't ever need to know this part of it. And they would, kind of tune out, if you will. Not all, but I mean, that could happen. And if you got too many people saying, well, that's not part of the job, you all often needed people in the room who could say, well, for me, it is. So, right. Because a lot of times the learners don't know what the variances are across the board in terms of the job assignments themselves. And then, there's that whole issue of it, adapting to their incoming prior knowledge. So from an e-learning perspective, is branching the key? Is that what you do? Or, how else do you accommodate the needs for adaptive learning in e-learning itself?
you brought up a lot of good points there. And one of them is somebody that comes in that has a lot of knowledge about, say, all of it, whatever's, in the list of objectives, or maybe some of it. And just to be clear, people do and I didn't mention it before, people do their own adaption, right? Whether they're reading, sitting in class, or doing e-learning, they do their own adaption. They choose how long they're going to spend on a particular screen. If they're going to read it in detail or just skim it. It's like, yep, I know that, done, next. Yep. Oh, this is new, right? So people do their own adaption. There is always some measure of learner control. And this is something I didn't mention, because in that the proceedings from that NSPI conference in the 60s, right? Who I found, so there was an article in there, but there was a paper in there by Norman Crowder who talked about, using branching to accommodate different levels of learners, right? But then there was a paper by Bob Mager and someone else, I can't remember the other person's name, but it was on actually learner control and the possibilities in the future of allowing learners to pick and choose and develop their own curricula in a way, right? You could consider that in a macro sense or a micro sense. I'm thinking of it in a micro sense, where it's like, and then that's what got me into reading Frank Wydra's book about learner controlled instruction. So branching plus some level of learner control, plus even before you get to branching, because that's perhaps a little bit more. It requires a little bit more in terms of design, thinking about the design. I was about to say design thinking, then I changed my mind. But it requires a little bit more thinking. The absolute simplest way to adapt is just to give somebody a pre-test or a pre-examination or pre-exercise. It's like, if you can do this, then you can bypass all this stuff. So that's like that's the course adjustment, right? It's like, yeah. You need this? Nope. Next, right? So that actually is surprisingly useful, right? It especially if you have, say, compliance courses or courses with requalification or continuing training. So you got to take it every year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever. Maybe the first few times you take it, you need to see everything. But after a while, it's like, well, I've been taking this same thing. I still remember what the emergency sirens sound like and what to do, right? If it's this one, I stay inside. If it's this one, I go outside. And if it's this one, everything's okay, right? So there's no reason for you to spend 5-10 minutes in that portion of the course learning what the emergency tones sound like, and how to recognize them and what they mean. You just know them now. So what to do in case of a fire, right? People, you learn some of that initially from the training, but then it gets reinforced annually, and then you just pick stuff up from people and just from working. So there's no reason to make people sit through all of that. Make them go through anything that's new, and make them go through anything that's absolutely critical, that absolutely needs to be reinforced. But
I like your addition of pre-testing, because back in the day, this was, best practices, good practices, whatever you want to say. But having a pre-test served a couple of purposes. It allowed people to skip what they already knew if they could test out, as the saying went. And it was also kind of an advanced organizer for people, because this said, this is what this is going to cover. So heads up, because this is, what the test is. And so you'd pay particular attention to that kind of content as you went through the instruction. And then if you did a post-test at the end, you could begin to measure the differences between incoming knowledge and skills and outgoing knowledge and skills. Now that was, in the context of the deployment, if you will. And that didn't mean it necessarily would transfer to the job, because there's a whole bunch of other issues with that. But that allowed you, that pre-testing served several purposes. But I think that, that's probably the largest way to adapt a longer chain of instructional events or learning experiences, is to allow people to test out. Because, the late Gary Rumler said something in 81, and I caught it on a video, and he said, and in 3 days, they leave knowing what they knew when they came in the door. And so too often we train people, we give them instruction on things that they already know, and it's a total waste of shareholder equity. So I like that adaptation mechanism, the pretest.
Yeah, it's incredibly useful. And not only so, now if the pretest is something that you can administer electronically, then not only do you have that signal that says let them bypass, or don't let them bypass, but you can now break that down and say, well, they got this part and this part, but this part. So you have a lot more data than you had. So depending on how long this pretest is, or the how fine-grained the assessment is, you can now start to design a slightly more customized learning path for the person, right? So when they go through, maybe they only have to see 40% of the material, right? New changes plus critical stuff, and this thing that they clearly didn't know. And you can do some of that with the pre-testing, and you have all that data, and you can treat it, with a model or numerically, or however you want to do it. Then you can do the branching thing. You can do some kind of, you can do a hybrid of the two, right? And then on top of this, so I think, yeah, I remember now, it came to me, the original question is, how does, and I don't want to say my approach, this is just the approach we're taking. How is it different from others? So it's not like there aren't several vendors out there that have adaptive learning systems. They're out there. And almost all of them will say they're using AI to intelligently select the learning path and guide learners through the material, the content, the learning, the most efficient way possible. And so, but it's not just AI. It's AI plus a large amount of data in the background that they have from all learners that have gone through whatever course it is, right? Which is great. But we don't have that, because I haven't had time to develop it, and it would require some significant changes to the way we actually work. So everything we have internally at OPG, Ontario Power Generation, right now, is predicated on what works with the way we work right now as instructional designers for e-learning. So pre-tests fit right in. Bypasses based on information I can pull from the training systems, like, oh, you've had this course before, and you've taken this particular course annually for 10 years. I can see that information. I can see what you did on the last 10 tests on this subject, right? And then we do have a model in the background that's kind of running on at the objective or micro objective level, which is not AI in any sense, but it is a numerical model that's based on, if you think about it this way, is like, if I ask you, as I'm presenting this information to you, and maybe I'm branching a little bit, and I'm asking you these questions, which would have been just exercises or assessments, formative assessments before, but now they're sources of information, right? This is the big thing, I think, that maybe a lot of people don't really appreciate, is every exercise or assessment that you've got before a final assessment is a source of information that can tell you or help guide what should come next. So this numerical model, it's a really simple one. There's no AI in it. There's no machine learning whatsoever. But when you combine that with instructional design and having thought out, how do you want to break down your objectives, right? Your learning objectives and micro objectives. And maybe you want to cover a couple things as topics off to the side in case somebody needs to refresh on something. If you're now tracking performance over the course of the learning experience and perhaps the history, because I can save all this information into the database, I can say, oh, this person is kind of an expert on this topic, right? They not only have they taken this course many times, but they've answered everything. As far as I can tell, they hardly ever get anything wrong on this. And I'm guessing you're probably not a gamer, but that if you get to a certain level, that's when I would open up the boss battle, right? Which is, we haven't done it yet, but I want to have the boss battle, which is, you have made it. This is the expert mode. Here's your review of the basic stuff, but now here's the next level. Still working out what would be the best, like what could you give as an exercise to, say, a nuclear plant shift manager who's possibly one of the most highly qualified people that you have, the most trained, has the most responsibility, oversees everything that's going on in the nuclear station when they're on shift. Like, they have to be, they're high caliber people, right? What are you going to do to interest them, right? So they can get something out of this course, right? It shouldn't just be about, oh, the procedures say this, and here's what the operating experience, and here's the things that went wrong last year, and blah, blah. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say blah, 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 but to this person that's the real expert, you should give them something else. Like, yes, maybe they currently meet all the objectives and you could have them bypass everything. But you could give them something, I think. Maybe it's a case study, right? Maybe it's a real barn burner of a case study. Or maybe it's like, okay, you, in 10, 15 minutes, you take the time you want. Give us a scenario, an evil scenario that we will ask people next year, right? And the best one, if you want your name to appear next to it, we'll put your name. This is, I've tried to pitch this idea. Nobody's going for it yet, but it's something I'd like to do. It's like, this evil scenario produced by Guy Wallace, right? So thank him when you fail it, right? Right? But it's that kind of thing. And a real expert would come up with something that's like, some of them might be sadistic and come up with something truly evil, but some of them might come up with something really thoughtful. It's like, this actually happened to me. Really bad shift. This happened, and this was already in progress at the time. It's a situation that might.
I like that idea. I would have said it's the application exercise from Hades.
Yes.
Where all hell breaks loose, and the people that have been closest to that maybe not have experienced it, but they can well imagine a hellacious scenario that's authentic. It could happen just because it hasn't, and it could be a test of the cognitive abilities of people to think their way through that kind of troubleshooting or problem solving. And that's one way to engage those people. So. But that's just the fodder for your application exercises or demonstrations or the information that you might give people. But that's a big question here. Do you go beyond the objectives just because you can, and is that the nature of e-learning, or do they need something else to stimulate their thinking? I remember back in the 80s at Motorola, they would have said that, we should maybe give people basket weaving courses because they'll get creative and they'll maybe solve some worthy business problem if we distract them with something else that taxes them in a different way. And I always thought that was kind of crazy, but I've read that, you know, that's sometimes a good approach. So when you begin an e-learning effort to create something, how do you consider adaptive learning when you're doing analysis and then moving into design before you get to development? What kinds of things do you have to think through?
Well, all the standard stuff you have to think about for e-learning design is there, right? You still have to design for whoever is considered the entry-level learner, right? If it's, you know, for whatever this course, whoever this course is intended for, you've got to design for, I don't want to, the best, most meaningful phrase for it is lowest common denominator.
Right.
That's right. That's kind of what Bob Mager or Norman Crowder, I think they both use that exact phrase in those papers I was talking about. But it's really the least experienced, least knowledgeable person that you expect to come into this learning experience. So you've still got to design for them. But now you can also think about, well, what about a mid-level person, right? What, you know, 5-6 years of experience, that they're not a total newbie anymore, right? And then what about the 20, you know, what about the grizzled veteran, right? We've got those, right? We've got people that have been working in this company for like 30, 35, like it's not much more than 35, but they've been working for a long time. They've seen everything, right? And they've seen everything more than once. So, and the nature of the nuclear power beast is that it's highly regulated, and there's risk, and there are things that you just, to make sure everybody's on the same page, you have to show them some stuff, and they might have to see it every year, and that's just the nature of it. But if you can go beyond just this very, very like fundamental, like transactional, like this is the procedures and this is the regulations and this is what you got to do. Like, can you take it to the next level and give people something a little bit more, right? Yeah, and I got so caught up in my own thoughts, I totally forgot what you asked me.
Well, I was wondering, you know, how should somebody that wants to do more adaptive learning,
yes,
what do they need to do differently when they're doing analysis and differently when they're doing design? And in your situation here, you're talking about newbies, people with some experience and people with a lot of experience. And how does one training e-learning course accommodate all of those people? So when you're doing analysis, you know, you have to analyze what's the content, what's the performance that we expect, what's the knowledge we expect people to have. But I guess you would have to approach analysis looking at the target audiences and beginning to make some assumptions, you know, having empathy for them so that we don't put them through something that they could, you know, test out or branch through much quicker than if they were a brand new person who doesn't really know much, the empty vessel. But so what strategies and tactics can you employ when you're doing analysis to kind of understand that and, you know, develop maybe 3 or 4 different levels of personas that help you guide you when you're doing design?
So this is very much like designing an interactive scenario, which is really popular right now. There's a lot of people doing it. One of the common tools people use to plan out one of these scenarios is called Twine, which is a branching. Well, Twine is made for making scenario-based games, but it's a great tool that lets you lay out different paths, right? And then make decisions. So if you start off, so in your design, in your standard e-learning design, you would take one, basically you'd have one linear path, and you'd take a learner from, say level 1, level 2, level 3 on objective 1, level 1, level 2, level 3 of objective 2. Or you might mix it up and interleave stuff, right? Because that has value too. So if you were to design your material in such a way that it's like, instead of going level 1, 2, 3 on this objective, level 1, 2, 3 on this objective, level 1, 2, 3 on this, let's put all the level 1s together. Then let's put all the level 2s together and all the level 3s together. And now, based on whatever information you have, whether it's from pre-testing or past information or job experience, learner history, can you pre-sort people onto 1, 2, or 3? And then, based on, for each objective, if it becomes clear that you've put someone onto level 3, but they're clearly not getting, they clearly don't know everything about this one objective, then you might branch down to level 2 and show them the level 2 stuff. And then let them get back up to level 3 when it becomes clear to you, or your course, your engine determines, it's like, yeah, they can go back to level 3 now, right? So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is adaptive remediation. So let's say you don't want to do 3 levels. It's too much to think about. So one of the standard designs back in the 60s and 70s, if you look back at some of the older references that actually mapped out, it's like, oh, this is how you would do branching design. And here's some of the different patterns you might have. One of the common patterns was you had a main line with event, 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 event. And then each one of those would have just below it remediation. So you would remediate and you'd come right back to the same topic, have them answer, if they can answer a question or whatever, then they progress. So it's like a main line with a remedial. Doesn't necessarily have to be a remedial path. It can be remediation on whatever's for a particular screen or chunk, right? So that's another way to go. So there's just so many different ways you can think about this, and I will have to send you the document because it's all mapped out. It was all mapped out in the late 60s and early 70s. And there's one really short pamphlet which I think was, I can't remember who produced it, but it was of course, the US government. But it maps out several different ways to do this, to think about it. And you can think of so many more.
Well, I'll be happy to put links to those references that you're mentioning in the show notes to the YouTube video. And we'll definitely get those posted so people can follow up with that. What kind of reaction are you getting from, the learners, your customers for your courses, and from your own management for doing all of this? Has it been well received, or has there been resistance?
So there's a range of reactions. I particularly remember one feedback I got from somebody saying, I don't need this voodoo magic stuff. Let me just go through the material. Right. And then on the other end of the spectrum is like, I like how this didn't make me slow down. Some people don't like the fact that it's way more interactive than it used to be. That's another side advantage of this. It becomes, once you start trying to get this information to decide what to do, it becomes way more interactive. And when it becomes way more interactive, it's like, I can no longer just scan the page and hit next, right? I gotta answer. I gotta answer something, or I gotta think about it, and I gotta solve a problem, or, game out a scenario in my head. So it becomes way more interactive, which should make it more effective.
Yes.
I mean, the more you have to think about what you've just read, the more you're actually going to get from it. Most people so I would say it's important to build in a way for people that don't want to do it to not do it. And you just put them on the standard linear path. That's fine. But a lot of people will choose to try the more challenging, or at least, some people will enjoy the challenge. Some people will just want to save time. And some people they're just willing to try something different, and they appreciate it. And they may not even, if you've done it well, they may not even realize it's being adapted to them, right? Which has advantages and disadvantages. The advantages is that they just think it's like, oh, this was designed really well. I didn't have to waste any of my own time. They don't know it adapted to them. But at the same time, it's like they don't know how much work you put into it to make it that adaptive, right? So you would like people to know. I mean, as a designer, I would like people to know. It's like, yeah, I tried, I built this so anybody can take this and it would sort them into the right path at any given moment. But what's, for them as a learner, they don't need to know that. They don't really need to know that. But I wouldn't mind it if they knew it and they appreciated it. So like I said,
people would appreciate it that had to occasionally dip into something with more detail to do the remediation, and then they probably would recognize where they were able to skip that, and then they would be more appreciative of that, I would guess. You can't please everybody.
Well, exactly. And there's always it's like, why are you asking me so many questions? I've gotten that feedback before, but other people like, I enjoy how interactive it is. Thank you. And I like the fact that it got more difficult. It was challenging all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of management, stakeholders, course owners, we've actually got course owners and subject matter experts that are asking for this now, which was not the case a couple of years ago when we first started talking about it, of course, because they had no experience with it. And the idea then was, well, no, they need to see everything. They need to see everything. All of this information is critical. It's like, really? Is all of it critical for everyone, every time?
Yeah.
Right. And if you take an experienced person and make them go through a course that's intended for a total novice, they quickly become somewhat disengaged from the learning process, right?
Yeah.
And I remember one feedback, it's like, this course, oh yes, making me take this course is like making me take, like making a Formula One race car driver take basic driver's ed, right? It doesn't make sense, and you can see it. You can see it in the feedback, especially from the more experienced people. We don't want to lose them, right? And if they have to try to focus on everything, even the stuff they already know, and they're not focusing on the stuff that they probably ought to be focusing on, which is the stuff they know less, right? Yeah. So if you lose them early on in the material, then they're not going to be really paying attention much when it gets the stuff they really ought to be paying attention to. So it's a matter of focus as well, which is why we called one of our adaptation modes focused adaptive remediation, which is based on a post-test or pre-test by objective, and it's built on bypasses. But it's not bypassing the whole course. It's now bypassing material associated with one objective or one micro objective. So that one would have saved me half an hour a couple years ago when I took our basic, annual requalification training. Mm-hmm. Because of the way one course was, like, I knew everything in the course except for this one thing. Everything in that module except for this one thing. And I ended up having to take the whole module because I got those particular questions wrong, right? It's like, ugh, right? Well, it turns out that, somebody in my group, she's my supervisor now, she had actually been thinking about that for a long time, but had never had the opportunity to implement it. And the organizational desire to actually do something like this. But once we were able to show that pre-testing and or bypasses based on learner history made sense and could lead to time savings, really, that was the first thing. Because what is management Like management, yes, they want it to be effective, but they also want to save time and save money. Well, the quickest the quickest way into a manager's heart is to show them they can get the same result for less time and money.
Exactly.
Right. And that was the first couple the pilots we did, and what I presented at the American Nuclear Society conference earlier this year was we were saving 35 to 45% depending on which of depending on which of the two pilot cases it was. And it's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. All right. Yeah, that raises some interest. So now we're starting to do a lot more, other things, and some things are, there's some feedback obviously that I'm not getting, but that is making its way up to management, because I've had managers ask me about something I didn't publicize or even ask about. It's like they're asking about it because they've either taken that course themselves or they've heard about it. Because sometimes the adaptation we're doing is not even letting you bypass anything. It's just making the exercises get a little more challenging as you go through.
Mm-hmm.
It's
not all about just skipping things. It's really about raising the bar and meeting that person's level of current knowledge and skills and making it challenging for them without making it impossible.
Exactly. So like maybe it's not just like questions. Perhaps it's like an exercise. And maybe if I can tell that you should really start off with a partially solved exercise, or it's like you could start with no help whatsoever, right? So it's like I don't need to treat everyone the same anymore. I can provide a little bit of gradation to match performance, experience, just how quickly they're learning, or how quickly they seem to be retaining information anyway. It's hard to say that somebody's actually learning as they're doing this, but if they can remember it later on, at least you can say there's some retention there. And then if it's a kind of an application question or problem, which a lot of ours would be, it's like, that's great. It's like, okay, not only do you know the basic terminology and the formulas and whatever, but you know how to do a plan. You know how to use our standard form for planning radiological work and do the calculations you need to do to decide what levels of protection are required, right? That would be a kind of exercise, right? And if you can jump right to the full exercise as opposed to having to start off with a worked example, great. We don't lose you, right? And I can't say that I can't 100% say we're avoiding the expertise reversal effect, right? But, if you force me if I'm an expert on topic A and you force me to start from ground zero and do it a completely different way than I know how to do it, you're really confusing me, right? It's like my dad was when he tried to help me with my algebra homework, right? Oh, that's not the way we do it, Dad.
Yeah.
The teacher said to do it this way, right?
Yeah, old math versus new math. Well, let me begin to bring us to a close here, but I've got two final questions. One of them I didn't share with you beforehand, but it struck me that you might be able to point our audience to some of the references and resources, and we will include those as best we can in the show notes of the video. But where would you point people to learn more about adaptive learning?
Okay, so right now, a lot of the available literature on this stuff is really technical. It's really mathematical, goes into stuff like item response theory or Bayesian, like knowledge or learner modeling, or because if you go and look at if you go and look at the literature right now, you'll find older stuff on computer aided instruction, and then there's intelligent tutoring. Intelligent tutoring, when you get to that level, what you're talking about is a system that it's probably got a lot of artificial intelligence and a ton of data behind it. And do you even really need an instructional designer then? Probably not. It's just a knowledge base of material, and then it's pulling stuff out, right? And feeding it to you based on how you're performing. So I would say the best way to get started is to think of, a lot of it's just standard instructional design theory and practice, but thinking about it a little differently in terms of not just one learner population, but a distribution of learner populations. And then thinking about it that way, and then thinking about how you might arrange something where it can serve those 2 or 3 different levels of audience without making people go through really stuff that's too elementary for them.
Mm-hmm.
Then I wrote an article for Learning Solutions Magazine, which I think is really good. So I would point people to that to kind of get an overview, because I cover different ways to think about adaption, and maybe some different levels of adaption. So like level 0 would be no adaption whatsoever. Level 1 is a simple bypass of the whole thing. Level 2 might be a more algorithmic thing or a branching model. Level 3 would be something with a little more intelligence behind it, or like this like I mentioned, the numerical models. So there might be some math or modeling going on in the background. And then level 4 would be like, intelligent tutor. Like it really, you're not even having to provide it like material anymore. It's just generating material on the fly based on one-on-one interaction. And then there's level X, which the article talks about level X and what that is. And then like they get out, I'm really open and I'll talk about anything to anybody. So they if they want to. I guess what I'm saying, there's actually a lot of stuff on Learning Solutions Magazine, a lot of articles in the past about adaptive learning, and there's actually a lot of stuff online, but it's difficult to parse at first because it's all directed at experts. Because it's if you're not already steeped in this material, it's difficult to say to determine what they're actually talking about. And that's why I didn't go there with any of this stuff, because first off, like it would be a completely different way of designing courses from what we have to do right now. So we decided to go take a path that's like we can ease into something a little more advanced, and it's a little bit of change management too, right? It's like we can try things, little steps. It's like, oh, that clearly didn't work, right? Or it's like, this is really working out a lot better. Let's go further down this path. But anything, I wanted to call out Christy Tucker. She puts together a lot of like material on branching scenario design, but she talks a lot about the practical use of twine for developing scenarios and doing the branching, and how many choices should you have. A lot of really good material. It's just on her blog. It's great. And then Anna Abramowitz is another person who talks a lot about scenario design. She talks a lot about narrative and story, not so much about how you use twine, which is why I kind of suggest Christy Tucker's stuff, because she talks about like how to use twine a lot. Then there is Kathy Moore. Kathy Moore, a lot of people might be familiar with the scenario she did about the young Army, I think it was an Army lieutenant in I think it was Afghanistan, dealing with a local leader and trying to get their support. I think it's called. Actually, you can't see this one anymore, but a lot of people have talked about it. It's called. The name of the guy is Haji Kamal, right? So a lot of people have seen this scenario. It really affected me in the way I think about branching per se, and the utility of it. Then, oh my God, can you hear me digging? Nope, that's not it. I don't have it. I got too many references here. Sorry about that. I'll send you the name of the book later, but it's an older reference. Anyway, there's just so much stuff, and anything having to do with programmed instruction. Oh my God, there's so much stuff about programmed instruction that's just online now, especially if it talks about the branching style. You can go on the web archive right now and find courses produced by, the Board of Education or the U.S. Army or Air Force that are written in that style. Like I found one recently is a complete course on human factors engineering, circa 1980, right? Which might be a little bit out of date, but it shows you exactly how this works. And then Bob Maker's book on writing instructional objectives. It's the perfect example, like of what you said earlier: larger frames, questions with branching. It's a great example. And that's where I would say most people should get started, because branching scenarios are so popular right now. It uses the exact same techniques. If you can do a branching scenario right now, you can do adaptive learning right now.
Excellent. Well, Billy, thank you so much for spending this time with us and sharing with us. Are any final words before we wrap up?
No, the only thing I say is the only other thing I'd say is none of this makes any difference if you're not targeting actual, like, legitimate performance, right? You could do the most technically interesting thing or the most creative thing in the world, and if you're not targeting legitimate performance in the real world, you're just wasting everybody's time, especially your own, because it takes longer to design this stuff.
There's no end if you don't have the anchor of authentic performance to decide, what's extraneous, what's really, or versus what's really required. But Billy, thank you so much for your time today, and send me those references, and I'll include those in the show notes. And I will be doing a blog post about this tomorrow, and introducing the video. But thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks a lot, guys. It was a pleasure talking with you.
All right. Bye.